Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Our next presentation is from Dr. Kathryn Lord, Making Sense of Senses.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Prescott, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming, both physically and virtually. So I'm going to be talking to you today about interspecies social behavior. And I think this topic is really interesting because between dogs and wolves, and even breeds of dogs, we see very different interspecies social behavior. And so what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at dogs and wolves and how they interact with other species, like sheep, for example, they show very different behaviors. So a wolf tends to show predatory behavior towards sheep, while you can raise a dog to actually have social bonds with a sheep and then protect them from predators like wolves. While other breeds of dogs show herding behavior, which is actually just a portion of that wolf predatory behavior minus the biting and killing bit. So I'm going to be talking about two studies. Let me back up. I'm going to be talking about two studies I've done that help to answer the question of why we see these differences between these fairly closely related animals, and in some cases, same species. And the two studies have to do with the development of behavior. The first I'm going to be talking about is the development of senses in wolves. And I'm going to talk about how the findings in that study help us to understand why it is that dogs can so easily form social bonds with other species, while wolves cannot. And then the second study I'm going to be talking about has to do with this hunting behavior and why it is that wolves have this fully functional behavior, while different breeds of dogs show portions of that behavior. So to start, let's talk about senses. So we know a lot about the development of the sensory system in dogs. They begin to smell the world around them between 1 and 2 weeks of age. Now, they probably do have chemoreception before this point, but it's most likely in the form of taste, because dogs can't find their mother at any distance until they are 10 days of age without a thermal tactile gradient. So they need that heat gradient to find her until they can smell at 10 days. Their eyes open at around 13 days of age, but at this point they're functionally blind. They're really just seeing lights and shadow. It's not until 4 weeks of age that they actually start to show what we call visually guided behavior and see shapes. So visually guided behavior is looking at something at a distance and walking directly towards it. But their vision still isn't fully developed until 6 weeks of age, when they'll reliably respond to visual stimuli. So dogs' ears open at about 3 weeks of age, at which point they'll startle to loud noises, but it's not until 4 weeks of age that they're actually reliably responding to sound. So we know a lot about dogs, but there hadn't previously been any research done on wolves. And before this study, people had merely assumed that wolves developed their senses at the same rate as dogs. Now, this actually is not a huge leap because, as we talked a little bit about yesterday, dogs and wolves are very closely related. They have the same karyotype, and what that is, they have the same number and types of chromosomes showed up there. And that allows them to interbreed and have fertile offspring, which has led systematists to actually name them as same species, which we talked about that controversy earlier. But they're genetically very similar despite that. So this fact makes it not a large leap to make the assumption that dogs and wolves develop their senses at the same time. However, we already know that dogs and wolves have some early developmental differences. Chief among these is the ability to walk. So dogs begin to walk at 3 weeks of age, but at that point it's very shaky. They're really not strong on their feet. It's not until 4 weeks of age that they're walking in a coordinated manner. Wolves, on the other hand, begin to walk in a coordinated manner at 2 weeks of age. That's 2 weeks different. And when I was raising dog and wolf pups, I had a hard time believing this. So I'd be working with the dog pups at 2 weeks, and they were just little puddles of fur. I couldn't possibly believe that wolves were walking around at this age. But when I was working with wolves, and they're all scurrying around at 2 weeks, I couldn't possibly believe that dogs were so slow. So I want to show you a little video to drive this point home. So first, I'm going to show you dogs. These guys are 18-day-old German Shepherd pups, and you're going to be focusing on that little that little lump there at the bottom. So you'll notice they're getting up and walking very shakily. So these guys are just starting to walk, and at this point, the only reason they walk is to get out of the nest to urinate and defecate. And they're so shaky, that guy at the bottom is going to tip over, just from a seated position. So they're just starting, very shaky. That's 18 days. Now here are some wolf pups. These guys are 16 days old. This is at Wolf Park, and for those of you familiar with Wolf Park, the wolf pup that's going to appear from the bottom that you'll be watching is Wolfgang. So here he comes, no problem, walking in a coordinated manner. Not only that, but he's interacting with his environment. He's not just getting out of the nest to do some necessary business, he's interacting, he's exploring. So very different. That's 2 days younger than those German Shepherd pups. So given this difference in the development of locomotor ability, we can make two hypotheses about the development of the sensory system in wolves. The first is that because wolves develop the ability to walk 2 weeks earlier than dogs, that they also develop the ability to see, hear, and smell 2 weeks before dogs. This would mean that dogs and wolves would have a very similar early experience. Both of them would begin to walk around and explore their environment once they could see, hear, and smell. Wolves would just be doing it 2 weeks earlier. The second hypothesis is that despite the fact that wolves develop the ability to walk 2 weeks earlier than dogs, they develop their sensory systems at the same time. Now that would be very interesting because that would mean that wolves and dogs had a very different early experience. It would mean that while dogs started walking and exploring once they could see, hear, and smell, wolves would be starting to exploring while they were blind and deaf. So to test this hypothesis, I looked at 4 groups of animal. The first on the upper left there, hand-raised wolves, 7 hand-raised wolves from 2 litters. They had to be hand-raised because I couldn't do this kind of work in such a close proximity to the wolf pups with their mother present. It just isn't safe. So I hand-raised them. And all pups were hand-raised for reasons other than this experiment, and all pups were raised in groups of a minimum of 3 to ensure normal social development with their own species. I also had 18 mother-reared German Shepherds from 3 different litters. Dogs, obviously, I can do this experiment with their mothers present, no problem. I also had 15 Border Collie pups, mother-reared from 2 litters. And finally, 10 hand-reared German Shepherd pups from 3 different litters. I needed the hand-reared dog pups because if I just compared the hand-reared wolf pups with the mother-raised dog pups, I wouldn't know if any differences I was seeing were due to the rearing or due to the fact that they were dogs and wolves. So I had these 3 litters of dog pups that were raised in the same manner as the wolves, and again, they were all taken away from their mother for reasons other than this experiment and all raised in groups of a minimum of 3 to ensure normal social development. So each pup was exposed to an olfactory, auditory, and visual stimuli once a week from the ages of 2 to 7 weeks. Now they got both a standard stimuli, which you'll see in this column, every week, and then a novel stimuli which changed each week. And I did that because I wasn't sure if they would habituate to the stimulus and stop responding because they weren't interested in it, and then I would be confused as to whether they couldn't actually attend to it or if they just weren't interested. So I also had these novel stimuli to ensure that they would orient if they could actually sense it. So they were given 1 minute to react to each of these stimuli, and all of the sessions were videotaped and then coded by 2 different experimenters for the first time they positively oriented towards the stimulus. And I'd just like to show you a little video clip of a dog pup positively orienting to a sound. You'll notice they're placed on this mat to ensure that they're the same distance away from the stimuli each time. And so ironically, when I put this in PowerPoint, the sound ends up being a little hard for you guys to hear, so I'll just let you know it's crowd noises that might help you hear it. So right as it starts, the pup turns around and orients towards the speaker. So, what did I find out? All pups oriented to olfactory stimuli during the first test at 2 weeks, with the exception of 3 animals that fell asleep on the mat. For auditory stimuli, the dogs first started to orient to auditory stimuli at 3.9 weeks on average, while the wolves did this at 3.7 weeks on average. For visual stimuli, dogs first started to orient towards it at 5.9 weeks, while wolves first started to orient towards visual stimuli at 6.1 weeks. So the dog data matches very well with the previous data on when dogs start to reliably respond to sensory stimulus. And the wolf data matches well with our current dog data, as well as previous data on when dogs start to reliably respond to sensory stimulus. But we don't know about these earlier benchmarks, that visually guided behavior and the first response to auditory stimuli, that startle response to auditory stimuli. So to get at that, I did an observational study. And this was on 11 wolf pups. That's the same 7 as before, but in another litter added on. And I observed them for 2 hours a day, 5 times a week, from 2 to 8 weeks of age, and then took those videotapes and coded for the first time each pup showed an auditory startle response and visually guided behavior. I then compared that data to notes taken by the caretakers daily. The caretakers were in contact with the wolf pups 24/7 for the first 4 weeks of age, and then after that, all waking hours. And then took the earliest point at which each pup first showed these behaviors and compared it to previous data. So this graph shows on the y-axis days. The little blue spotted line is the previous data, which shows that on average, the first auditory startle response was at 19.5 days. Each of those spots is one of my wolves. 10 of the 11 first showed the auditory startle response at 19 days, and 1 showed it at 17 days. So an average of 18.8. For the first visually guided behavior, we have the previous data at 25 days on average for dogs, and for my wolves, it was 26.6 days on average. Now, something interesting is that you'll notice on the auditory behavior, it was fairly conserved. I had 10 of 11 dogs doing it on the exact same day, and for vision, it's more spread out, which is exactly what was found in previous data. The visual system is much more plastic. Now, 26.6 days is significantly different statistically from 25 days, but I don't think it's functionally significant because the visual system is notoriously plastic. It has to be. Eye-opening happens over a course of weeks in a litter. So if it wasn't, you'd really mess up the developing visual system of these animals. So a day and a half functionally isn't going to make a big difference in the visual system. So what do we know so far? Well, we know that wolves develop the ability to smell at the same time as dogs. We know they develop the ability to hear at the same time as dogs. And we know they develop the ability to see at the same time as dogs. However, they develop the ability to walk 2 weeks earlier than dogs. So if we go back to our original hypotheses, the first hypothesis, as you'll remember, was that wolves develop their ability to see, hear, and smell 2 weeks before dogs because of that difference in the ability to walk. And the current data refutes that hypothesis. The second hypothesis was that wolves develop the ability to walk 2 weeks earlier, but they develop their sensory systems at the same time. And that is supported by the current data. So this is really interesting. This means that that wolf pup I showed you at 16 days was blind and deaf and exploring its environment. That is completely different from a dog who can see, hear, and smell when he starts to explore his environment. And a change in this early developmental timing will probably affect adult behavior, particularly because this is all happening during a very sensitive period in these animals' lives, known as the critical period of socialization. Now again, we know a lot about the critical period of socialization in dogs and not so much about it in wolves. The critical period of socialization in a wild animal allows them to form species recognition. What species do I belong to? In captivity, this is the time period during which we can form interspecies social bonds. If you place an animal with another species during the critical period of socialization, they can form social bonds with that species. And anything they experience during this time that's novel will become familiar to them. So in the dogs, We know the critical period of socialization starts with the ability to explore, which, as I told you earlier, in dogs starts at 4 weeks of age. Now, at 4 weeks of age, they have little to no fear, and they will approach novelty readily. So they'll just run right up to it. But over the next 4 weeks, fear gradually increases until it reaches a point where they will run away from novelty rather than approach it. And this brings a critical period of socialization to a close. And in dogs, this happens at 8 weeks of age, giving them a 4-week critical period of socialization. Now, I know this group is well read, and so you're probably thinking right now, but I read Scott and Fuller, and depending on which paper you read, it might have said it was from 2 to 16 weeks, or 3 to 14 weeks, or 3 to 9 weeks, or 2 to 8 weeks. It changes like every paper he wrote. So where does that come from, and why am I saying 4 to 8 weeks? So it turns out that this period doesn't just start and stop. It's a very gradual increase and decrease. And it starts the very first time you can elicit this familiarization response, this showing them novelty and having it become familiar, seems to be at 2 weeks of age. And it can be dragged out all the way till 16 weeks. So why is 4 to 8 weeks an important time period? Well, there's 2 reasons. The first is that it's the time period during which this process happens the fastest. So you need the least amount of exposure to produce the most response. The other thing is that between 4 and 8 weeks, the dog itself is putting itself in new situations. Everything outside of that has been experimentally manipulated. So while I can expose a dog to a new sound at 3 weeks, and it will become familiar to it, the dog itself is not walking around and purposefully exposing itself to these things. It's not exploring yet. But I, as an experimenter, can expose it to these things, and it has an effect. Same on the other side, at 8 weeks, a dog will run away from new things, but I, as an experimenter, can force it to stay in contact with a new thing for 24 hours at 9 weeks, and it will become familiar to it. Now, the further out I go, the more time I have to get that exposure to actually become familiar, right? So when I get up to 16 weeks, I'm going to have to expose it for way longer to get any kind of familiarization. So between 4 and 8 weeks, we have a period during which the animal itself is exposing itself to novelty and becoming familiar with it, which is important to me because I'm now going to compare them to wolves who aren't being manipulated. So, critical period of socialization in dogs, 4 to 8 weeks. Now, I mentioned that because the development in the sensory system is changing during this time period, it might have some important effects on adult behavior. And the adult behavior I'd like to talk about is interspecies socialization. Now that turns out, as I mentioned before, is quite different between dogs and wolves. And dogs, it turns out, can form interspecies social bonds extremely easily. They need 90 minutes of contact with another species, like humans, between 4 and 8 weeks, so during that critical period. Now, I'm not talking about 90 minutes a day or 90 minutes a week. I'm talking about 90 minutes total, and you'll get a dog who will solicit human attention. Now, that's not going to be your well-socialized pet. It's still going to be on the minimal side of socialization, but it will solicit human attention. To get that kind of behavior from a wolf, you need a much more intensive process. It must start before 3 weeks, or it will not work. Normal protocol is to pull the wolf pups out of the den at 10 days of age, and then stay in contact with them for 24 hours a day. Between 4 and 6 weeks of age, you can't sleep with them anymore. They start to bite you in the ears. It's very painful. And so after that point, you spend all waking hours with them. And I recently read a paper that said that mother wolves start to sleep outside of the den at 4 weeks, and that made me feel much better about myself. Now, even after this intensive socialization process, wolves don't develop the same intensity of attachment as dogs do. It's a very different beast. So dogs, after this process, will generalize, if they're well socialized, they'll generalize their attachment to pretty much all humans, whereas a well-socialized wolf will not make this generalization. Actually, my very first litter I socialized with another woman who is about my height and blonde, about the same build. And then we found out after we were completing the process that the main caretaker of this wolf at the zoo was a 6'2" gentleman who was completely bald and tended to wear baseball caps. So that was a problem. The wolves didn't want to have anything to do with him, and despite his dedication and sitting outside their enclosures days and days and days on end, they still were horrified of him. So they don't make these generalizations. Also, they're more fearful of novelty in general as compared to dogs. And finally, they are tame, not domesticated. The difference is that tameness is something that occurs over the life of an animal. I could tame a wolf, and when she had puppies, her pups would be just as wild as if I'd never done anything to their mother. Now, domestication is something that happens over generations and therefore changes the species. But also, a tame animal directs its species typical behavior towards the individuals it's socialized with. So things like hunting behavior, if I raised a wolf pup and then went in the closure with a twisted ankle, that would most likely trigger their hunting behavior, making them much more dangerous than a dog. So this leads us to the question, what is the critical period of socialization in the wolves? Well, we know the critical period of socialization starts with this ability to explore, and as I told you before, that starts in wolves at 2 weeks of age. So we've got that end of the question. How about the other end? When does the critical period end in wolves? Well, there's a hypothesis out there that it ends, that it ends at 3 weeks of age. And that comes from that fact that I mentioned earlier, that we can't socialize wolves after 3 weeks of age. So that makes sense. That would give wolves a 1 week critical period of socialization, which would explain all the things I just told you about, right? If they have a 1 week critical period of socialization, they'd be harder to socialize because we only have 1 week to do it in. We'd have to start it before 3 weeks because the critical period ends at 3 weeks. They'd be more fearful of novelty because they have only 1 week to experience it versus the 4 weeks in dogs. The problem with this is the data that I just gave you. If we overlay our sensory data with this hypothesis, it gets a little more questionable. If wolves ended their critical period of socialization at 3 weeks, then they would do so before they were able to hear and see. That means for the rest of their life, everything they saw and heard would be novel and very difficult to change. That seems unlikely to me. So I have another hypothesis. If we go into the literature, we actually see that there is evidence for wolves experience the avoidance of novelty at 6 weeks of age. So why hasn't this come up before? Well, this would give wolves a 4 week critical period of socialization, which is exactly the same as dogs and explains none of those differences. So it seemed like a bad hypothesis at the time. But when we overlay this new sensory data, suddenly it becomes clear. So I'd like you to imagine you pull a wolf pup out of the den at 10 days of age. This wolf pup has until 3 weeks to become familiar with all of the smells of the human environment. At 3 weeks, it starts to hear. Everything it hears is novel, and we're 1 week into the critical period of socialization, so it's also frightening. Now, they can easily attach that novel sound to the familiar smells that they've been experiencing and continue along with the process. Again, at 4 weeks, they start to see shapes. They are scary, but they can attach them to the familiar sounds and to a greater degree to the familiar smells and continue along with the process. Now imagine you pulled a wolf out of the den at 3 weeks of age. That wolf has no experience with human scents, so those are all novel. It also has all new sounds, and it's 1 week into the critical period, so all of those novel things are also frightening. With zero familiarity, that wolf pup will run and hide, and that will slow the process down. Now, we're only 1 week into the critical period of socialization, so they can get over this fear and continue along. It just delays the process. But just as they're doing that, they start to see, and all of that is also novel and frightening, causing them to hide again. So this would slow down the critical period so much that they would not be able to form a social bond. It's important to realize that if we do socialize wolves at 3 weeks, there is some effect. We do reduce that flight distance, so they get a little closer to people. So it has some effect, but they never get enough time to actually form those social bonds with people. So I'm suggesting that both dogs and wolves have a 4 week critical period of socialization, but wolves have a critical period of socialization that starts and ends 2 weeks before dogs. This effectively makes it so that dogs have a critical period for 4 weeks during which they can see, hear, and smell their environment. Wolves have a critical period of 4 weeks during which they can smell the environment for 4 weeks, but they can only hear the environment for 3 weeks, and they can only see the environment for 2 weeks. This would mean that olfaction would be extraordinarily important to a wolf in a novel situation. Not only that, but things would generally be more frightening if they were novel, because a dog, when it sees something that's potentially novel, can either see something that looks familiar, can hear something familiar, or smell something familiar, and any of those will make that item less scary. For a wolf, they really need the olfaction to make it less scary. That's what they have the most experience with. And it's interesting to note that this hypothesis is supported by previous data on the evolution of domestication. And so here we have our Balaev's foxes again, which we've all been mentioning briefly. And just to remind you what happened with these guys, Balaev selected for silver foxes with the smallest flight distance. And when he did that, after a very short period of time, 10 generations, he started to see some major differences in his less fearful animals. He saw a change in melanization, so he saw different coat patterns. Instead of being the nice silver black that we used for fur farming, he started to see two tones. He also started to see floppy ears and curled up tails, increased barking, as well as a potentially diestrous cycle, so they're coming to heat twice a year, all of things which separate dogs from wolves. He also did a study to see when they started to avoid novelty, helpfully enough for me. And he compared them with wolves that were not put through this, foxes, what species are we talking about? Compared them with foxes that had not gone through this selection process, so these wild foxes that were not selected for. And he saw in the wild foxes that they started to avoid novelty at 6 weeks, whereas the domesticated foxes didn't start to avoid novelty until after 8 weeks. So Balaev thought that all of these changes he was seeing in the foxes was because he selected for flight distance, and in so doing made a small genetic change which then had a cascading effect on all of these other traits. And it's possible that that small genetic change that he did was switching the critical period from 2 to 6 weeks to 4 to 8 weeks. And in so doing, it interacted with a lot of other developmental processes and changed the whole character of the animal. So if we're going to go way out there, we could say that this could explain how domestication occurred. So in conclusion, the sensory system of dogs and wolves develop at the same time. The resulting change creates a change in experience. And these findings offer a new hypothesis for the timing of critical periods in wolves. So, I'm now going to change things a bit. I'm going to talk about another study that I've done on the development of hunting behavior in dogs and wolves. So, you can look at behaviors in terms of their motor patterns. And motor patterns are units that ethologists use to measure behavior. You can think of them like snapshots in time, and they all have rules. These rules are things like the quality of the motor pattern, which is the shape, which I'll describe in this in a moment. You have the sequence, what does it show up before and what does it show up after? You have the frequency, how often does it show up? And you have the duration, for how long is it displayed? Now, for wolf hunting behavior, the motor patterns are orient, and the shape of that behavior is that the head is above the shoulders, the ears are up, and the ears, eyes, and nose are all focused in on a potential prey item. Then you have eye and stalk, which happen at the same time. Eye refers to the head position, which is now lowered at or below the levels of the shoulders. The ears are tipped forward or out, and the eyes and nose are still focused in on that potential prey item. Stalk refers to the body position. The legs are bent, and the animal is either stock still or slowly creeping forward. We then go on to chase, which is precisely what it sounds like. Then there's grab bite, which is the initial bite to the prey. And a large animal like a moose, shown here, is the first thing they can get a hold of, the flank, something like that. Then they move on to the kill bite, which in wolves is a bleeding bite. Each species has a different kind of kill bite. Each predator has a different kind of kill bite. In the felines, it tends to be a suffocating bite. And that brings me to the point that motor patterns have to be selected for. This is something that is species typical. That's what makes it interesting to ethologists who are studying the evolution of behavior. And then the kill bite is not pictured here for my more sensitive viewers. And then we go on to dissecting bite. And dissecting bite is the pulling apart of the prey animal. Now, it turns out that dogs actually have the same motor patterns as wolves. But these motor patterns are shown with different rules, different frequencies, different sequences, different context. So in the border collie, which has been selected for herding, we have orient, eye, stalk, and chase. But grab bite and kill bite are considered false. For the Schützen German Shepherd, which you'll see being used for police work or military work, they have orient, chase, and grab bite. You don't want them to sneak up on the bad guy, you just want them to go grab him, and you don't really want them to kill him either, so knock that out. So it's been previously hypothesized that the differences in motor pattern expression between these canis morphs is due to a change in the timing of the development of those motor patterns. So in order to describe this more clearly, I first need to take you through the developmental stages of the canis. So we start with a neonate. That's the newborn. Now, the interesting thing about the newborn is it's adapted to a completely different environment than the adult. The newborn is adapted to the environment of mom. And so because of that, he has different behaviors, different motor pattern sequences. And so for the neonate, he has his own foraging sequence. He still has orient, but as you recall from the last study, he can't hear or see. He can't even smell at the beginning. So he uses thermal tactile gradients in order to find mom. That's his orient, following the thermal tactile gradient. Then once he reaches her ventral surface, he roots by swinging his head back and forth, attaches to the nipple, suckles, and treads simultaneously. So that sequence is just as well adapted as the adult sequence, but it's adapted to a different environment. We then have the adult, whose sequence I just described, adapted to the environment of killing large animals. So the problem is, how do we get from this one highly adapted animal to the other? And the answer is the juvenile period, which starts with the critical period of socialization. Now, during this time period, what happens is the motor patterns from the neonate start to shut off. And when they do, they can be displayed without all those rules I talked about. They can be displayed outside of any particular sequence. They can be displayed outside of any particular species typical frequency or context. They can just show up whenever they want. And at the same time, individually, adult motor patterns are switching on. So they have no context, they have no rules, they have no frequency, no context, no sequencing. So they can be showing up at any time. And so what the juvenile does is it experiments with all these available motor patterns and shuffles them together and creates sort of an insane group of a mix of these motor patterns, which we don't see anyplace else, and what we call play. So this crazy mix of motor patterns turns into a really weird behavior, and I'd like to show you an example of some play behavior here. And I'm going to narrate the motor patterns that you're going to see. Now, one of the things you'll see here is something which Beckhoff described as the play bow. I will not be including that in my description because under the definition of motor pattern, I do not believe that it has been selected for. So I don't think it's a motor pattern. I think it's a byproduct of other things. And if you want to talk more about that, you can ask me and Ray about it during the panel discussion. I will leave it there. So I'm going to narrate this little movie. You're going to be watching these two guys up at the top, particularly this little pup here. So he's going to grab bite the basket, and then he's going to do a little mouse pounce, and then he's going to grab bite his little friend there, and he's going to sniff around at the bottom of this basket and sort of shuffle. And then he's going to do two mouse pounces and chase his own tail, and then lie down. So there's everything all together, right? We've got a whole bunch of stuff just shuffled together in a chaotic way, not predictable at all, and not doing any particular function. So what happens during this is that these motor patterns are shuffled together, so all the available motor patterns can be shuffled together and experimented with, and when they land on a combination that's rewarding, they do it again, and again, and again, and again. And the hypothesis that has been presented by both Coppinger and Burkhardt is that the more often a motor pattern or a motor pattern sequence is displayed during this play period, the more likely it will show up in the adult typical behavior. Now, for most of this, I'm going to be talking about the genetically timed onsets of these behaviors, but I would just like to make a side note that the environment can also play a particularly important role in when these motor patterns show up. Because if a motor pattern shows up and it can't be displayed because of the environment, it's as if it never turned on. And I had an interesting experience with this with some work I did at a guide dog institution, where the pups were living in kennels, and the play they were showing was basically the big puppies beating up on the little puppies, which is not the kind of behavior we want to see in our adult guide dogs. So we wanted to create more cooperative play. And the idea was that if we broke up the environment, the little pups could escape and the big pups would find something else to do. And so it turned out the best way to do this was to put a giant truck tire in with them. And suddenly, as soon as I put that truck tire in, all sorts of new behaviors started to show up during their play. So they would do things like climb, which actually increased the muscularization in both the shoulder and pelvic girdles. They started actually climbing the chain link on their fence after I gave them the tires. They also did little balance beam routines. They did cooperatively, they would take toys, so two puppies would take a toy and stuff it into the well of the tire. So by the end of the day, all of their toys would be inside the tire. They would also do little NASCAR races where two puppies would get inside the well of the tire and run as fast as they could, and everybody else would just kind of watch them go around. And my favorite, which I cannot explain at all, but I think is so wacky that I always tell people about it, these were large litters of about 12, 13, 14 pups. One puppy would sit in the middle of the tire, and then all the other puppies would put their front feet up on the tire. And then the pup in the middle would lead one bark, and everybody else would give back one bark. And then the puppy in the middle would bark singly, and then everybody else would give back a bark. And they would do this until I got the video camera and was in front of them and hitting record, and then they'd all kind of walk off nonchalantly like it had never happened. But I saw this in multiple litters, so if anybody thinks of why that happens, I'd love to hear a reason. So, just a side note, environment's also very important, even though I'm going to be talking about genetics here mostly. So, if this hypothesis is true, we have several predictions. The first is that motor patterns included in breed-specific behaviors should show up relatively early during this critical period. So, in Border Collies, for example, that would be orient, eye, stalk, and chase. In German Shepherds, that would be orient, chase, and grab bite. So, motor patterns that aren't included in breed-specific behaviors should show up relatively later during the critical period. So in Border Collies, that's grab bite, and in German Shepherds, that's eye and stalk. But we have a problem. What is relatively early and relatively late? How early is early enough for them to express this behavior? Well, luckily for me, we have wolves, and wolves express all of these behaviors. So we can use them as a gauge to determine when is it early enough for this to actually occur. So we can also predict that motor patterns included in breed-typical behaviors should show up at the same time as they do in wolves, relative to the critical period. Whereas motor patterns not included in breed-typical behavior should onset later than they do in wolves. We can make some similar predictions for the frequency. So motor patterns included in breed-specific sequences should show up at a relatively high rate during play, whereas, so for Border Collies, orient, eye, stalk, and chase, and German Shepherds, orient, chase, and grab bite. Motor patterns not included in breed-specific behavior should show up at a relatively low frequency. So in Border Collies, that's grab bite, and in German Shepherds, eye and stalk. Now again, we can use our wolves as sort of a gauge and say that motor patterns that are included in breed-specific sequences should show up at the same frequency as they do in wolves, while motor patterns not included in breed-specific sequences should onset at a relatively low rate in comparison to wolves. And finally, we can make predictions about the sequencing of behaviors. Motor pattern pairs included in breed-specific sequences should show up at a relatively high frequency. So for Border Collies, that's orient eye, eye stalk, and stalk chase. And for German Shepherds, that's orient chase and chase grab bite. Whereas motor patterns not included in breed-specific sequences should show up at a relatively low frequency. So in Border Collies, that's chase grab bite. And for German Shepherds, it's orient eye, stalk, and chase. Now, we can also use our wolves as a gauge. So motor pattern pairs included in breed-specific sequences should show up at the same frequency as they do in wolves, whereas motor pattern pairs not included in breed-specific sequences should show up at a frequency lower than wolves. Now, there's one thing here I'd like to point out before we move on. This sequence, orient chase, is not something we see in wolves. This is not part of their sequence. They have other things in between. So German Shepherds should show this at a higher rate than wolves do because it's breed typical for them, but we don't see it in wolves. So how'd I test it? This should look familiar. Basically the same group, but a few little changes. For the wolves, I now have 11 wolf pups. It's the same 2 litters plus an extra litter. For the dogs, it's important to note that my German Shepherds were all Schutzen lineage from the German lines. That means no froggy hips like we saw in that picture yesterday. They're all functional, and they're all bred for this behavior. For my Border Collies, they're all from herding lineages. No show dogs. And that's all that's new. So what I do, I observed the wolves from five times a week from 2 weeks of age through 8 weeks of age. I did this at dusk and dawn each day because wolves are crepuscular, which means that they're most active at dusk and dawn. For the dogs, I observed them 2 times a week for their 2nd and 3rd week, but observed them 5 times a week for their 4 through 8 weeks. And that was because of what I told you earlier. Wolves are the little puddles at 2 and 3 weeks. So I just observed them to make sure no motor patterns were showing up at this time period. Now, dogs in homes are not crepuscular. They're active when their humans are active, so I observed them as close to feeding time as possible. So all pups were observed for 15 minutes 2 times during each of these sessions, so they got a total of a half hour of observation. And all of those videotapes were coded for the first appearance, frequency, duration, and sequencing of orient, eye, stalk, chase, grab, bite, and 62 other motor patterns, which I only mentioned because I made my students learn them, and so I thought that should be out there. So, results. For the onset, I did find that motor patterns included in breed-specific sequences onset at the same time as wolves or even earlier. So in my Border Collies, eye and stalk onset at the same time as they did in wolves, where orient and chase actually onset earlier than they did in wolves. Now, this was not what I predicted, but because orient and chase are actually hypertrophied, they show up at an even higher rate in adult Border Collies than they do in wolves, it actually still supports the hypothesis. In German Shepherds, grab, bite, orient, and chase all showed up for the first time before they did in wolves. Again, hypertrophied in the adult. But motor patterns not included in the breed-specific sequences did not show up later than they did in wolves. So for Border Collies, grab, bite, which we expected to show up later than it would in wolves, showed up earlier than it did in wolves. That did not support our hypothesis. For German Shepherds, eye and stalk, instead of showing up later than they did in wolves, showed up at the same time as they did in wolves. Also didn't support the hypothesis. For frequency, motor patterns included in breed-specific behaviors did show up at the same or even higher frequencies than they did in wolves. So for both Border Collies and German Shepherds, orient and chase showed up at higher levels than they did in wolves. For Border Collies, stalk showed up at the same rate as it did in wolves, and for German Shepherds, grab, bite showed up at the same rate as it did in wolves. But again, motor patterns not included in breed-specific sequences did not show up at lower frequencies than they did in wolves. So for German Shepherds, eye and stalk actually showed up at the same rate as it did in wolves. And in Border Collies, grab, bite, which we were expecting to show up at a lower rate, showed up at a higher rate than it did in wolves. The one exception to this trend was eye. So eye in the Border Collie, actually, which we expected to show up at the same rate as it would in wolves, showed up at a lower rate. And in German Shepherds, that didn't support our hypothesis. In German Shepherds, eye, which we expected to show up at a lower rate, actually did show up at a lower rate than it did in the wolves. And this is particularly interesting because eye was the only motor pattern that showed any difference between my rearing groups. So in German Shepherds, the hand-reared German Shepherds first showed eye at 52 days on average, whereas the mother-reared German Shepherd show eye for the first time at 45 days on average. So at least for eye, environment was extremely important in the display of this motor pattern. And for pairs, motor pattern pairs that were included in breed-specific sequences did show up at the same or higher rates than in wolves. So in Border Collies, orient eye, eye stalk, and stalk chase all showed up at the same rate as it did in wolves. And for our German Shepherds, you recall that orient chase is abnormal and doesn't show up in wolves. It did show up at a higher rate than it did in wolves. And chase grab bite in German Shepherds showed at a higher rate than it did in wolves. But motor pattern sequences not included in breed-specific behaviors, you guys can probably say this along with me now, did not show up at a lower rate than in wolves. So for German Shepherds, Orient Eye, eye stalk, and stalk chase all showed up at the same rate as they did in wolves. So that does not support a hypothesis. The exception for this was the border collies. Chase and grab bite, which we expected to show up at a lower rate, did in fact show up at a lower rate. So when we come down to it, even though grab bite showed up earlier and was showing at higher frequencies, once it got sequenced, they didn't really like to chase and grab bite. And I think the reason for this is because the reason that this didn't work the way I expected to is because I made an incorrect assumption at the beginning of this whole thing. I told you that grab bite wasn't desirable in border collies, and that is true. But it doesn't mean they don't have it. They have grab bite. I think the difference is merely that it's difficult to get them to show it. And the rule that makes that happen is something called threshold. So the threshold is the amount of stimulus necessary to get an animal to perform a motor pattern. And in the hunting sequence, that tends to be a distance factor. So for this guy up here, here's our border collie. He's currently stalking. When he hits this distance away from the sheep, he's going to break into a chase. So the threshold to get into chase is a specific distance. And the same thing is actually true of grab bite. We do see grab bite in border collies, and in fact, a lot of shepherds like a little bite in their border collie. If they have some stubborn sheep, they'd like them to bite them at the heels a little bit. But when they get, when they get too close, they show grab bite, but they have to get really close to those sheep, which allows the shepherd during trials to keep the animal outside of that threshold very easily so that he won't break into grab bite without any warning. But he does show grab bite. It's just an extremely high threshold. And so where I'd like to go with this is to look at how those thresholds get developed, which I didn't look at yet. The other thing we saw was our German Shepherds and eye stalk, which did not do what we thought it would. I thought eye stalk would be showing up at a lower level. And I think the reason it didn't was twofold. The first was a methodological problem. I told you I watched these guys for 2 15-minute blocks of time each. And the hope there was that I would get them moving around at some point during that time, right? If you watch puppies for a half hour, there's a good chance they'll be sleeping the entire time, especially early on. They sleep a lot. So by splitting up the time periods, I was hoping one of those would be awake. But what I didn't realize is that in border collies, eye stalk play tends to happen in little clumps. So like a half hour, all of the 8 border collie pups in that litter would be playing eye stalk games for a full half hour, which means I only got a few puppies doing the behavior, and by the time I got to everybody else, they were fast asleep. So I got a few high levels of eye stalk and a few dogs, compared to the German Shepherds, who showed eye stalk occasionally, but it was here and there. So one pup would do it a little bit, barely at all, and another pup would do it a little bit, barely at all. But when I added them all together, they looked the same as the border collies who were doing it all the time. So I think what I need to do in the future is instead look at how many times those motor patterns are showing up regardless who's performing them, and I think I get a more accurate measure. The other thing I ignored was the end of the critical period. So I told you if a motor pattern shows up late enough, it won't get sequenced. And that late enough is the end of the critical period. Once you get outside of the critical period, they've already started to sequence stuff up so much that it's really easy to get rid of those motor patterns after that point. If they show up after the critical period, it's very easy to put them in an environment where that won't get sequenced. And so what I didn't look at, I'll come back to that. Oh, no. I'm missing a slide. Can I get back in? I'll just explain it while we're doing it. All right, so what I didn't look at was the end of the critical period of socialization. And I actually did a pilot study with German Shepherds and Labradors in a guide dog institution to look at when the end of the critical period occurred. And I was interested in that setting because it turns out that they have a lot of German Shepherds failing for fear. And one reason for that would be that they are being raised in a fairly sterile environment up through 8 weeks and then being fostered out to homes. Now, if they finished their critical period before they went out to homes, then when they got into the home with all that complex stimulation, they'd already be avoiding novelty, and it wouldn't have a very big effect. So I looked at the difference of the end of the critical period between German Shepherds and the Labrador Retrievers who weren't failing for fear so much. And the data suggested that German Shepherds were hitting the end of the critical period closer to 7 weeks, while Labradors were hitting it closer to 9 weeks, which means the Labradors had a full week in the home with stairs and cats and all sorts of exciting things to get that information and have it become familiar. Whereas the German Shepherds had already hit the onset of fear, and so not only did they not have that input, but it was actually really traumatizing for them to suddenly be thrown in a car by themselves without any of their siblings for the first time, right at the end of that critical period, which would certainly have that effect. But for this current study, let me see if I can find no, it's not there. But this current study, it's interesting, is that I found that eye and stalk onset at fairly similar times in Border Collies and German Shepherds. So German Shepherds actually had an onset of eye that was later than Border Collies, but not significantly so. And in both, it was turning on at right towards the beginning of 7 weeks of age. So if German Shepherds are hitting the end of their critical period at 7 weeks of age, that means eye and stalk turn on, and then the critical period ends, which means they don't have a lot of time to incorporate it into the sequences. So while the onset looks very similar, the practical application of it is very different. So the experience is very different. They only get a few days to use that information, whereas the Border Collies get a full another week. So if there is a difference there, that would be very important. So that's another thing I'd like to look at. So in conclusion, the onset and frequency of adult motor patterns in these 3 canis morphs do vary. There is a heterochronic, a change in timing. There's a developmental difference, which is really important and exciting. But it's still not clear whether the timing of the onset and frequency of these motor patterns during early development can predict adult behavior. We still need more research there. Into thresholds, end of critical periods. It's a lot more complex than we thought. And that is the end.